One of the most rebellious people in the world, what people thought about sex, and one of the biggest issues in America that we don't talk about enough. I'm your host, Chad Arena, and we have all of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in number 10, we have Patience Boston. Here's a story of someone who just didn't want to follow the rules, and the more you tried to get her to listen, the more she wanted to rebel. Patience Boston was born in 1711, and it would seem that her life revolved around everything but patience. When she was young, her father gave her to the crown to serve in servitude. It wasn't the best life. It was very strict, but it did let the girl learn how to be proper, and for that time was a very valuable thing to do. But it was something that she definitely didn't want to do. She was known for not respecting the teachings of the church and disrespecting her teachers. She eventually was released from the crown, and from here she went wild. She started drinking, fighting, and committing crimes. She eventually married a slave, and because of this, the slave master said that she was a slave as well. She would then beat her husband and cheat on him, and eventually she was so unruly that she was traded off to another slave master. No one wanted to keep her until she ended up with a family where she hated her master and decided to kill his grandchild. She took him out to a well and drowned him, and then told the family what she had done. She was arrested and later hanged for her crimes, but not before she gave birth to a child that was taken in by the church. This is a wild story because if she was born today and did everything but killing the kid, she would probably just be a celebrity. Coming in at number 9, we have Timothy Dexter. Honestly, this sounds like a colonial era Dumb and Dumber, but there's only one dude. Timothy Dexter was born into a poor family in the 18th century. He refused to accept the fact that he was poor, and one day he got up and left his family to go strike it rich. He became a leather worker, but he had a plan going. See, there was a currency back then called colonials. No one used them because of British rule. Timothy was using his earnings to buy discontinued currency, which was worthless, so he could grab it for almost nothing. Then when America got independence, the colonial was reissued at a fraction of the value, but Timothy had so many of them that he was now a millionaire. He bought a massive estate and had statues of himself built all over the place. Everyone in the area hated him because they all came from money, and now there was this poor farmer's child that was living in their neighborhood. Some things never change. But that didn't stop him from having a good time. He once hosted a fake funeral to see how many people would show up, and over 3,000 people came. Other wealthy people tried to ruin him. They would give him horrible investment advice, but he would only make more money off of these poor decisions. And the cherry on top was when he wrote a memoir about his life and then handed it out to all the wealthy people who lived around him. He was trying to show off how great his life had been. But Timothy couldn't read or write, so the whole thing was a mess, and it only made people hate him more. But this dude didn't care. He was living the life he had always dreamed of. I don't know who this guy is, but I like him a lot. Coming in number 8, we have the poor treatment of colonial Americans. So back when America was under British rule, they were being treated like second-class citizens. They didn't have the means to make a lot of the resources that they needed, so they were constantly reaching out to Britain to send them over goods so they wouldn't all die over the winter. But Britain didn't respect America, so everything they would send over was trash that they didn't need. Often supplies would arrive in America that were spoiled, or simply there just wasn't enough of the things that they needed. Now things start to make a little more sense why they pushed back against the English and fought to be their own country. Coming in at number 7, we have the Battle of the Frogs. Now, I don't know if this one is very scary or just strange. It depends on whether or not you're afraid of frogs. But for this one, we have to head over to the year 1758. This was during the French-Indian War, which was the first major war to take place on American soil after the Declaration of Independence was signed. There were people in the town of Windham, Connecticut, who heard a great commotion. They figured this was one of the armies that was approaching them, so the people in the town didn't want to get raided, so they prepared for a fight. They armed themselves and waited. They could still hear this noise, but they didn't see any of the troops walking towards their town. This was very strange, so they decided that they would get the jump on whoever this was, and they started to move towards the source of this strange noise. As they got closer, they realized that this wasn't humans making the sound, but they couldn't figure out what it was. They got to a small pond, and they found thousands of frogs fighting over a small area of water. These frogs were all killing each other and jumping everywhere. It looked like a plague come to life. At the end of this amphibious battle, there were thousands of frogs dead. If you have a fear of frogs, that was probably the worst thing you could have ever heard in your life. Otherwise, it's just very strange. Coming in at number 6, we have the Scarlet Letter. One of the most famous books in American history is Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. The book showcased some of the values of the era and how people were very backwards back then. The book talks about how anyone who committed an act of adultery should be shamed for life. There was no chance to redeem yourself. It even went as far to say your clothing should be branded with the mark of someone who is unfaithful so everyone would know what you had done. They were very afraid of sex back then. One look at the internet today and they would die from a heart attack. Coming in at number 5, we have the death toll. History likes to have the idea of people coming to America on boats ready to build a new life, ready to start a family and get away from the sickness and plagues of Europe. But that wasn't the case at all. Nearly 50% of the people who came over to America originally died. This was for lots of reasons. Some of them were sick by the time they arrived and there was little to no medical services, so they basically just died shortly after arrival. Another big part of this was the fact that they didn't know how to survive the winter out there. Many people froze or starved to death once winter came around. So many of the people who traveled over didn't realize that they were traveling to their doom. Coming in number 4, we have John Billington. Sometimes you meet someone and you think, I don't know what's wrong with this guy, but they suck. Not like old Timothy Dexter, that guy was great and will go down in history as one of the best people who ever lived. But wherever John Billington went, he would cause problems for all the people around him. It seemed like he thought he was smarter than everyone around him. He was on the Mayflower coming over to America, which was a 66-day voyage. And during this time, he made nearly every person on the ship hate him. He tried to get a mutiny going, but no one was on board. And when he reached the shore, he was punished and then started making trouble with the governor. They had some back and forth, and then he went on to build his home. His biggest problem was that he was a Catholic, and most of the people around him were Puritans, so he hated everyone. Eventually, he started to have a feud with his neighbor. The two of them battled for years until one day John killed his neighbor. He was caught and then sentenced to death. They call him the first American murderer, but people are really forgetting about all of the Native American lives that were lost. Coming in at number 3, we have nobody showered. Well, for one, showers weren't invented yet, but people still didn't bathe by the standards that we would see as normal today. Back then, it was seen as unhealthy to bathe more than once every few months. To keep clean, you would just change your clothes if you were rich. And you better believe that there was no such thing as deodorant. We all have fantasies about traveling back in time, but in reality, the smell would be so bad it would ruin any fun you thought you could have. Coming in at number 2, we have the Salem witch trials. If you're a witch now, no one really cares. I went on a date with a witch once and it was fine. She told me about some spells and some spell books that she was reading, and she really seemed to be into painting her nails black. But I wasn't running to the police to get her arrested because I thought she was working with the dark arts. If anything, I wanted her to cast a spell on me so I could become more shredded. But back in 1692, if you were caught being a witch, they would take you to court to confess your crimes and they would probably kill you. The Salem witch trials took place in 1692 and 1693 in the town of Salem, Massachusetts. There were apparently a bunch of witches and over 200 people were arrested and brought to court under the suspicion of using witchcraft. I mean, this sounds like every time there's something new to be afraid of and people go off and chase it down. Everyone always thinks that will fix something. Well, in the end, 30 people were found guilty. Most of them were women, but some of them were men as well. And contrary to popular belief, no one was burnt at the stake. That is something that was made up later to make the story more salacious. Fire was a precious commodity back then, and you wouldn't use it all on witches. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have the relationship with the Native Americans. This is by far the most horrific part of the English coming over to colonize America. See, America was already filled with people, but the settlers and the people during Colonial America didn't see them as people. They wanted to eradicate and take the land from the Native American people. They fought wars against them, they spread disease like smallpox through the Native American tribes, and they built residential schools where they could take their children from their parents and force them to learn a new way of life. They would practice either Catholicism or Christianity, and they would be beaten if they spoke their native language. And they would be in ways much more horrible than that. The things that colonizing America did to the Native Americans was horrible, and the effects are still very much felt today. We could do an entire list just on those atrocities, and probably the worst part about this is every time people talk about the mistreatment of certain races, Native Americans are usually left out of the conversation. Something that we should all very much think about. Alright guys, that has been our list. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Until next time, I've been your host, Jade Arena, and I hope you enjoyed this content.